is Dwayne Washington. We want to welcome you back to another exciting episode of CIO Radio. I am the BI. Hi, this is Dwayne Washington. We want to welcome you back to another exciting episode of CIO Radio. I am the BI Pharaoh, and I've got my sidekick, my homie right here. Javier, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Dwayne. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today for an exciting episode of CIO Radio.
You know, we've got a great CIO coming on in just a moment. I can't wait to bring him on. I've personally known this guy for a long time, and it's exciting to bring him apart. He's done so much. Right now, he's with F&I as a CIO there, handling all the things from a financial perspective and automotive perspective. He's going to talk a little bit about that, but he's done so much. He's owned companies. He's written software that's been used all over the world, from places like Pizza Hut and all types of food services. And so I'm proud to bring him on today. We're talking about self-service, but I'm going to bring him on right now. None other than Mr. Gary Peak. Gary, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Dwayne. How are you?
I am doing wonderful. Hey, tell everybody out there about yourself.
Well, I've been in a technology industry for 25 plus years, and starting from as a software engineer up to a variety of different roles. I think a big part of my career is building software companies and launching technologies in different verticals. So it's been a big part of it. The family side of it's really great too. So big part of my life with a beautiful wife and 5 amazing kids.
5, you know what? You got me beat, bro. You got me beat. 5 children. How old are they?
The oldest is 17 and goes down to 12. So they're packed pretty tight in there.
17 to 12. We call that back-to-back. So tell us about what you're doing now out at F&I.
Yeah, so F&I Express is a company I joined in early January, and it is a technology company that's focused on delivering software and technologies for the F&I space at dealerships in the auto industry. And so if you think about you're going in to buy a new car, you work really hard to negotiate a great price on that new car. And after you've done that, they're going to walk you back typically to the F&I office where you work on any bank contracts for the loan that you may take out on the car or lease or whatever. And then they're going to offer you different types of aftermarket products like vehicle service warranties, extended warranties, tire and wheel coverage, scratch and dent coverage, gap, credit life, those kind of coverages. And so that's an area that we focus on, which is integrating the various dealer and finance systems that are in these dealerships into 150 plus companies that provide these aftermarket products. So we're integration heavy and we bring real-time rates for very specific vehicle information back to the dealership office for the F&I office in real time. And so that's a big part of what we do. We also work with the lenders and the insurance providers that are bringing these products to the market at the end of the process when you sell your car or trade it in or it's totaled or whatever the change and that's going to drive a termination of the aftermarket product contract. So we build automation technologies in that space too. So we work with about 2,500 dealerships across the U.S. and growing, about 40 different banks that are providing loans into that market and 150 plus companies that provide the aftermarket products.
So Gary, great to have you here in the show. To understand a little bit better, if I express, if you can explain for our listeners, is it like a one-stop shop? And I mean, I remember when I bought my last car, right? I got everything, the deal is done, then finally go to the back of the office and they start telling you like, okay, the finance, the insurance, the service plan, the tires, all these kinds of things, right? Is it something where you make it like a one-stop shop to get all that into one package and making the buying experience so much easier? Is that what I understand?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. One is certainly trying to improve the experience for the consumer at the dealership. So dealerships are really concerned about the amount of time that you spend at their dealership. And if you've ever gone through that process before, finding a car and then negotiating a price and then doing all the final contracts, getting the car ready to, take delivery of it at the end, can be many hours at the dealership. I've probably myself spent 4 to 5 hours at times, working through the car buying process. And so when you think about that last, part of the process, we're certainly trying to speed up that piece by integrating with their technology platforms to bring the rates, for those insurance products back to the consumer, present those in a way that they can make an informed decision and buy those products. And then we bundle those up and actually create a digital contract for all of those aftermarket products. So it's not printing off the old dot matrix, old style printers in a 5-ply form that goes through the printer. It's all automated now. So definitely it's trying to improve the experience, but also there's a compliance part on the part of the insurance companies. So we're helping drive better compliance for how those products are presented to consumer to make sure the right information is presented, and that's a big part of it as well.
Good deal. Well, Gary, you've been ahead of several different organizations from an IT perspective, including Rent-A-Center, and you've ran organizations that were IT focused. And so as we evolve from an IT organization and even BI organizations, we've seen this idea of self-service come around, and it's becoming more and more prevalent. It's more and more part of the rhetoric that we hear going around, and more part of the conversation. If you can talk to the listeners a little bit about how you feel about self-service, maybe some of your own self-service journeys, or some things that you may be trying to implement right now.
Sure. I think it's interesting. I had a conversation with some of the team here last week, and we talked a little bit about, what technology was like for us 20 or 25 years ago, or at least for those of us who were working at that point. And it was so easy in so many different ways when you go back to that point. Today, it's much, much more complicated. We're dealing with, data privacy, personally identifiable information. On the payment side, we're dealing with PCI requirements and fraud and security. And when you look at the total scope of work that a technology organization has to do today, it's massively complex. And the data is such a big part of it. I can look at all the projects that we're running and stack those up. But data is like the air we breathe. It's in everything around all of those projects. And so certainly a very critical point. But probably the biggest issue I see is how do we deliver at the rate of speed that the business needs to get access to information, get new reports, new analytics, and those things. And it's really challenging when you look at all the different projects that are stacking up. And it's part of the frustration, I think, for our business partners in terms of their need for information is far accelerated versus what it was even 10, 15 years ago. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. So self-service is one of the ideas about how do we start to put more power in the hands of either business users at the company or possibly our strategic partners or end users of our products and services, so our consumers. And there's a lot of value in that. The more power that we can put into their hands, the more pressure that takes off the technology organization to deliver within certain timeframes.
So it's sounding kind of like they're two competing and complementary things going on at the same time. And once again, if you're just joining us, we have Gary Peak, the CIO of F&I. He's been CIO of other organizations as well, led up Rent-A-Center as well as his own company, putting out products all around the world, over 100 countries. He's been able to deploy products. So we're talking about a seasoned veteran here. And so it seems like that as technology gets more advanced and more complicated with security and the whole nine, and as we sit right now, not too long ago, the breach with Facebook has happened. And so once we're looking at a more complex situation when it comes to IT, and at the same time we have a more savvy user that's asking for more control, that's asking for more information and for more data. And so how do you think we balance the two of, yes, we want to give you more information. Yes, we want to give you self-service, and like you said, to alleviate some of the pressure on IT, so that your BI team is not just a report mill, that is actually working on some very, very important things, but not just moving a column in a report. So how do we, in your opinion, how do we give power to the users, but maintain all the things that we need to maintain, maintaining security, maintaining compliance? How do we put those things together?
Well, I think you've outlined the complexity of it pretty well there, because there's quite a few things that come to mind as you talk about that. If I go back and gosh, probably, if I boil down to some of the base things that I love doing, which is software design, really seeing a business problem and designing software for it. I've always been someone very experienced about the entire user experience for the end users using software. And that's extremely important. I also think that applies to the reporting side of the world. There are a lot of different ways to deliver data, and I think the experience of how that data is delivered is really important in how it's consumed. But the complexity really comes into the easier I want to make it for the end user. So if you think about in a self-service world, the easier I want to make it for someone to gain value out of the data that's being provided there, I think the harder it is on the front end to get data structured and in a way that somebody's going to be able to access it and understand it. Because, a lot of times, especially with legacy platforms, we're grabbing data into a data warehouse from a lot of different platforms, right? So if you think about some of these systems being designed, legacy systems a number of years ago, what data meant, data being stored in, in different fields within the database, maybe had a different meaning for a developer than what the business user was thinking. So you have the whole data chain of custody as that data flows through different systems to the data warehouse. And then how does that get interpreted by the business user for getting value out of that, whether it's, analyzing data from a marketing perspective to help drive, product positioning or pricing or things like that. To getting production reports or performance reports about how a certain business unit or group is performing. So I think there's a lot of challenges that companies face, both within the technology and the business group about I would call it kind of chaos in the metrics area, which is really understanding the data that's coming through and is it accurate and does it mean what I think it's going to mean. At a previous company, we ran into an issue about defining terms within the organization. You're talking about a large company, multiple business units, and people were using terms that actually meant different things to different people. And so how does the executive team or a leader of a business unit know that the data that they're looking at compared to another business unit actually matches up? So there's a lot of different challenges. How do you make sure that from a data security perspective that data that's more HR driven or more confidential, or you're dealing with PII data from consumers that's protected at the same time you're giving people access to information to be able to develop ad hoc reports or drive their own self-service metrics. So I don't know that there's an easy solution to any of that. I think that's why we all have jobs in this space, because it is very complex.
Right. Gary, I love what you said, chaos in metrics, right? And I think that you can extend that to chaos in the implementations, sometimes chaos in the sense of how it looks from the outside technology organization. I remember once during an implementation of SAP, it connected with like 40 different systems, right? So the integration was massive, right? From the outside, it seems chaos. From the inside, we probably know better how things flow, the data flows, and where things are happening. But there's security, there's integrations, there's data lakes, there's all these things, right? So when you're planning, when you try to figure out what the stack should be of technology that should be at the forefront to deliver the value to a business in terms of reports and data, how do you plan for that stack? Do you have like I have these 10 building blocks, where it's the database is the ETL tool, the BI framework, your data governance or MDM. How do you plan for that stack, and what do you think are the main stacks that people need or organizations need to be able to deliver that business value?
Boy, that's a really good question. So probably if I was going to think about how I'd answer that, it's related to maybe what I'm starting to go through at F&I Express. So when you think about the technologies that we develop, we're kind of at the center point of, or the nexus. I'll use a term that Gartner throws around a lot, but if you think about the nexus of data coming from different companies and part of the customer journey, the car buying experience, we're in the middle of that data flowing through all of these organizations. We have tons and tons of data. All of that's stored in our databases, but when I joined F&I Express, which is a smaller company, growing rapidly, Cox Automotive out of Atlanta, which is a $25 billion company, is one of our primary shareholders, and so we've got good investment back on that side. But we didn't have a data warehouse here. So we have a lot of data in different databases for applications that we've built, but no structure to that data for reporting and analytics. It's really about driving the integrations between different partners and the dealerships and things like that. So, the first step for us was there was a big need on the business side for a lot of different areas. One is, how do we provide reporting that helps us understand if our pricing structure for the service we provide is correct? How do we analyze that? Well, we didn't have a method for doing that. We have to, because we're a transactional / SaaS model, we didn't have a really good way for driving our billing and invoicing. So we're having to look at new ways to get access to that data. We're trying to look at performance reports, not only for how our different provider partners are working with us, but then also how are our systems performing in terms of near real-time access to the APIs that we've built. So there's a lot of different business issues that we can't solve for currently. And so the first step that we went through here was kind of a discovery phase to look at all the different business needs that we have as a company to try and grow and build our company. And we're scaling really fast, and we need data to be able to make better decisions. And that's one of the challenges. So we've actually started several weeks back, and we went through a discovery process through interviews with all the key business stakeholders and team leaders in different groups to understand what are the business problems we have challenges with. And that's kind of the foundation for us to start this whole process that will later end up as a data warehouse and a reporting mechanism that will drive internally for the business. And then secondarily, we're going to take that to our strategic partners. And the third level is, okay, what about consumers who need access to this information? Is there a way we can drive it down to the consumer level? So it's a journey. It's a long road. We're just getting started on that. But for us, it's really about what's the business need driving the need for this data.
You actually answered a couple of questions I was getting ready to ask, and very well done. What I was going to ask is, what's first? And what I'm hearing is that you guys decided to say, hey, let's get with the business and find out what the business drivers are, what the business questions are. Definitely the right move. That's the difference between having a veteran and having a novice, a neophyte. So wonderful job there, Gary. A side note, if you need some help with that, give me a call. Got you covered. So let me ask you something. So we see CIOs coming out of nowhere these days, and now having the distinction between CDOs and CTOs. And so before, a CIO at any company would be responsible for all the technology. And some companies are tending to separate those so that a portion of the technology is handled by one person, another portion of maybe the data is handled by something else, and the innovation may be handled by somebody else. For those people that are stepping up in either the data space or the CIO space very purely, and maybe they're new to that area, and let's just say you only had one piece of advice that you could give them, kind of with respect to self-service, what would you, and they're looking at how do we empower our users, and they're brand new to the space, what advice would you give that person?
Well, I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier about data is the air we breathe in a company. And so, whether it's a CIO, CTO, Chief Digital Officer, Chief Data Officer, there's a lot of these different, the C-suite at the technology side has exploded. And I think, data is such a big part of that. So I have a 14-year-old son who's starting to think about where do I go in the future? And we talked a lot about, the growing market is around analytics and data, and how do I take this, and what the difference is with big data and how companies approach that. So I think data is certainly key. I think the size of the organization is going to drive that a little bit in terms of where the needs are between data and digital, or CIO, CTO. With F&I Express, this was the first time they've had a CIO. And so their positioning with bringing me in for this role was not just the technology side, but part of the business management team. And so when I think of, matter of fact, I'm reading a book right now called Be the Business from Martha Heller, which is a great book about, CIOs being part of the business. So I try to focus on that there's not a separation between IT and business. IT is the business these days.
Right.
But I think data is such an important thing. It's really, really challenging. It looks simple to some on the front end, and certainly talking to other business leaders, there's this sense that I can flip a switch and now I've got big data and we're getting value out of it.
Yeah.
And so it's just not that easy, and it takes time and work. But I think there's a real need for someone that's leading the data. And I think that gets to another thing you guys have been around a lot, which is data ownership. Who has ownership for the data? Is it a business unit leader? Is it a technology leader who knows that space? And so there's a good, probably a good business case around the business unit, a key person in the business unit driving data ownership, but it's got to be locked arm in arm with someone that's on the technology side that can help understand that. I've been amazed over the years at how much that a number of people on the technology side of the business know the data and know the business sometimes better than the business operators themselves. And that's because they're working day in and day out with the data and with the systems and with various people across the business unit, that they learn the business pretty well through that. So I think there's a key aspect of partnership between the two that's going to drive data ownership.
Yeah,
I think I got off a little bit from your question there, but
No, you're good.
No,
You right on point.
And that's a great point, Gary. And I was, as we were talking about data, just a few things came to my mind, right? Data wrangling, data movement, data management, right? So the question I had, like a follow-up for that, how do you deal with data overflow, right? There's so much data around us, right? As you said, 20, 25 years ago, things maybe were much simpler. Business was still similar, but things were much simpler from a technology perspective. Now there's a data overflow, right? Data everywhere. We make data, by the minute, in petabytes by the minute, right, or the second. How would you recommend or help people say, okay, we have this data overflow. Where do you find the value? How do you help people narrow down and say, this is where we think the value is? And there's no, secret sauce or silver bullet for that. But I think there's some general guidelines that we may want to apply. Or what have you seen in your opinion, or what have you seen in the past in terms of handling that data overflow and getting to the value in the data?
I think one of the things that comes to mind as you ask that question is there's a lot of drive towards big data, and there's a lot of companies that have done really well in analyzing big data. For example, at a previous company, one of the sayings I had is, until we get control of our little data, we can't work on our big data.
Yeah.
So, and that's exactly the point. It's data overflow, and storage is cheap, so we store everything these days, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you make sense of that, and how do you get the most value of it? And I think the process is not too unlike other processes that you go through in decision making, which gets down to prioritization. And there's this value decision that goes on around what's going to drive the most value for the company. Is it, a revenue generating decision that you've got to use data for? Is it, operating expense reduction? Is it market analytics or, product analytics, pricing, all those different things that you're trying to solve for? And so there's probably a formula that's used for looking at what's delivering the value, what the value is of a particular analysis that you're going to do on a set of data versus the time it takes to get there. So the tendency is, when you're prioritizing those, is to say, well, gosh, this project's going to bring us the most value. And so we need to go do that project, even though it's a 15-month project, to go make that happen.
Right.
And so that's, and people march through that. But there's also, if you think more of an agile organization trying to deliver value quickly, there's another calculation that you can do that says, this is a 45-day or 60-day project. It's going to return a small amount of value, but if we knock that out first in the first 60 days, then start on the 15-month project, that little project is going to be delivering value for the next 15 months until we get the other project done.
Yeah.
If you go the big project first, then you don't get any value for 15 months unless you can find ways to break it down into small components. And so I'm a very strong proponent of agile processes and breaking down things into small chunks so you can get to the value faster. But really it comes down to prioritization and looking at things from a total value delivery work stream or value stream around what's going to bring value the quickest. It's not always the biggest projects first.
You know, we definitely preach agile here on the CIO radio. And for those that are listening, if you're not using an agile methodology or Kanban or some type of iterative methodology from a software development perspective, let me tell you something. Stop what you're doing right now. Throw the waterfall away. Do something different. We're just about out of time, but I do want to ask one final question to you, Gary. Once again, our guest today on CIO Radio is Gary Peak. He is the CIO of F&I. Gary, what's maybe one of the biggest mistakes that you see CIOs making today? Especially, it could be any mistake, but if you have any, and specifically in the area of self-service, it'll be great.
I think the biggest challenge really on the CIO space is that there's a lot of churn with a lot of companies. And I think that starts really at the business level, that bringing in a CIO for a company is a big decision. A lot of research and recruiting work goes to make that happen. And typically there's a couple of big problems that the C-suite is trying to solve for. But CIOs, I think what the average lifespan is around 3 years. And because there's this disillusionment that goes on that they're going to be able to flip the switch for big data or flip the switch for self-service or other projects. And a lot of times these things don't happen quickly enough. So I think a lot of the challenges that are facing in the very beginning, and this is just scratching the surface, which is around communication at two different levels. Obviously, a CIO has to be able to communicate and work well with the executive leadership team of a company and have really crystal clear direction on what's driving the technology side of the business so that you're enabling the company to grow or whatever they're trying to achieve. But being able to communicate that down and helping the various teams understand the value of why they're doing certain things is really important. And to me, that's foundational. It's that communication up and down that's the starting point. Everything after that is really challenging, and certainly getting the C-suite to have the proper expectations about what a project's going to do or what it's going to deliver for an organization is really challenging. A lot of the business cases I've seen in the past, the value that's brought to the organization is typically overbaked, and the expectations for the value are much higher than what reality is.
Well, you know what? I want to thank you. That's great insight. We really appreciate your time today. I know you're doing phenomenal things out there at F&I. They are blessed to be able to have you, and we're blessed to be able to have you today here on CIO Radio. Javier, got anything else do we want to close out today with?
Gary, thank you so much for the insight. I think it's very valuable, and a lot of people will benefit from listening to all the great recipes or all the great insight that you provided to them. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Wonderful.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you guys for watching, and thank you for listening to CIO Radio. It's Javier and Dwayne, the BI Pharaoh, and we are signing off. We'll see you next time right here on CIO Radio.